I guess I'll start again. So let me welcome everyone to today's Cold War Studies seminar. My name is Mark Kramer. I am the head of the Cold War Studies program here at Harvard, and I am very pleased to welcome two speakers today, both of whom are experts on the former Yugoslavia, and we are going to be talking about Yugoslavia's role in the Cold War, and especially its relationship with the Soviet Union, and more generally about the significance of the role it played both between East and West. So let me very quickly introduce the speakers so that I don't take up too much time. First will be Miloš Rastović, who is a scholar in residence at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh and is also the founder and head of the American Council on Southeastern Asia. And then to my left here is Nadia Bourgeeva, who is a professor of international relations and international law at the Balkan Studies Institute of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and also is a visiting scholar here at long-term visiting scholar here at the Davis Center. So with that, let me turn first to Miloš.
Thank you, Dr. Kramer. I would like to thank you to Davis Center for organizing this event, Dr. Kramer and Nadia and everybody else who participate in organization. And my subject is Socialist Yugoslavia and non-aligned movement. When you mention somebody today, non-aligned movement, it doesn't look very interesting and attractive subject. Who really cares in today's world about that movement? That's only at the first glance. The non-aligned movement during the Cold War appears irrelevant to current international relations. However, if you look more closely, we can see the non-aligned movement is vital to understanding the undercurrents of today's international relations. In the conclusion, I will clarify why this movement is relevant to today's world. First, I will explain what led Yugoslavia to be part of this movement, and I'll also say, I will explain the foundation of non-aligned movement, that we have full picture of the movement. In November 1943, at the Tehran Conference, Presidents Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill decided to support Josip Broz Tito's partisan movement in Yugoslavia in fighting Nazi Germany by developing supplies and weapons. In the fall of 1944, the Red Army of the Soviet Union helped Tito's partisans to liberate Yugoslavia. From that time, Tito's regime killed over 60,000 people, and that was at the first moment killed only 60,000 people who represented the intellectual elite of the society because of their differing opinions about the future of Yugoslavia and their support for Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Tito's regime was supported by Stalin until 1948. Once Tito gained enough power to pursue his own domestic and foreign policy without support of Moscow, or better to say, to be more independent from Moscow, Stalin decided to remove Tito from power in Yugoslavia and initiated a series of attempted coups. Stalin didn't accept being bypassed in important agreements among the Balkan countries. After helping Tito partisan Yugoslavia in 1944 and 45 to fight Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union expected that in return, it would have the leverage to demand various concessions from Yugoslavia. Tito was he was sent from Moscow. He was there and with Stalin. He had a training there, and he knew very well how the Communist Party of Russia, Soviet Union was organized. And when he came back to Yugoslavia, he became the president, actually the general secretary of the Communist Party Yugoslavia in 1937. And what he did, he applied the same Soviet model on the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The only difference what he did is from the beginning of his presidency of the Communist Party Yugoslavia, that he reformed the party, he removed all people from the previous board and put the people who were more loyal to him than to Stalin. And that's how he built his independence from Stalin, which culminated in 1948. He wanted to, from the beginning, be more independent. The conflict between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union became official with the Infobiro resolution adopted on June 28, 1948. It lasted until the death of Stalin in 1953. It was followed by numerous border incidents and the economic and political isolation of Yugoslavia. A meeting held in June in 1948 in Bucharest, Romania, wasn't attended by any of the Yugoslav communists. The famous resolution of the Infobiro was adopted and Yugoslavia was excluded from this organization. The official reason was the Communist Party Yugoslavia was deviated from the Marxist-Leninist policy. They implemented a hostile policy toward the Soviet Union, among others. The reaction of the Yugoslav communists to expulsion from the Infobiro came at the end of the following month at the Fifth Party Congress in Belgrade, at which the famous note to Stalin was officially confirmed. Yugoslavia was left to fend for itself, and in the following weeks, a period of retaliation and confrontation with people who opposed Tito's decision began. Daniela Popovic, in her article, she says that about over 55,000 communists declared themselves in favor of the Infobiro resolution. Many of them, she says, over 16,000 communists ending up in a prison in Goli Otok. That's like naked island in Adriatic Seas, and that was the huge political prisoner camp in the former Yugoslavia. Many of them prisoners were tortured or they were killed because they didn't agree with Tito's policy. The most of them were Serbs, Montenegrins, and people who supported the Soviet Union. A total of about 172,000 people were arrested in Yugoslavia from 1948 to 1952. Historian Ivan Timofeyev said, quote, "It was a fight between two strong characters, but it wasn't the fight between Stalin and Tito, fight between democracy and totalitarianism." Stalin died in 1953, and the Infobiro officially ceased to exist in 1956. The reconciliation between the new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, and Tito preceded its demise. Khrushchev visited Belgrade on May 26, 1955. One of those steps towards reconciliation was shutting down the activities of the Infobiro. A year before dissolution of the Infobiro, the Warsaw Pact was established as the umbrella military political organization of the Eastern Bloc in response to NATO. How important the exit of Yugoslavia from the Soviet orbit was for the Truman administration is best expressed by the CIA assessment from that year. Quote, "Tito's apostasy deprived the Soviet Union of its strongest bastion of Southern Eastern Europe, a stronghold that previously provided the Soviet Union with direct access to the Mediterranean and served as a powerful base for exerting pressure on Greece, Italy, and Austria. The loss of Yugoslavia reduced Soviet potential and weakened the strategic position of the Soviet Union in the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean." The serious approach to this issue actually started when Yugoslav intelligence officer Vladimir Velebit asked U.S. government whether the U.S. government will support or military support Yugoslavia. Tito, at that time, actually a month later, officially requested military assistance from the West, and the U.S. Congress adopted the law on emergency aid to Yugoslavia. In October 1951, the Military Assistance Pact was signed in Belgrade, and Yugoslavia was included in the American Mutual Assistance Act. United States, Britain, and France started sending arms to Yugoslavia, and that was until 1957 when Belgrade terminated that agreement. Historian Miller Akimashit says that the US government at the time of President Reagan considered the communist Yugoslavia was an American ally, like Austria and Sweden. I often quoted the document that the National Security Council formulated in 1982 and 84, stating that Yugoslavia was an American island. They only asked from Tito to prosecute Castro in the non-aligned movement, and I will come back later on that. NATO was founded in 1949, and Eisenhower was commander of American troops in Europe during the war and later of NATO. And he proposed that Greece, Turkey, Spain, Portugal, together with Yugoslavia, should be admitted to NATO. And it was logical. NATO began to create a southern wing, and these four countries would permanently close the Soviet access to Mediterranean. Josip Broz showed immediate interest in this strategic combination. And in February 1953, the three countries, Greece, Turkey, and Yugoslavia, concluded a treaty of friendship that provided for coordinating military commands. Through Greece and Turkey, Yugoslavia was included in American defense plans, and this alliance was considered an addition to NATO as the southeastern wing of Europe. Thus, Tito Yugoslavia will be the first communist country to be built by the capitalist money. This agreement that they made in 1953 didn't last very long. The first and main reason is that in 1956, Presidents Khrushchev and Tito, they made agreement, they reconciliate their relationship, and didn't exist anymore any danger from Soviet Union. And Tito and Yugoslavia didn't need any protection anymore. And the second thing is at that time, the dispute about the Cyprus between Turkey and Greece started. And the third thing is that Yugoslavia soon launched a policy of non-alignment. And until the end of its existence in the early 1990s, social Yugoslavia hadn't joined any military pact advocating for the so-called policy of peaceful existence. The first phase of the non-aligned movement spans the period from World War II until the Belgrade Conference. The movement aroused as an individual foreign policy commitment of certain non-bloc countries of Southern and Southeastern Asia, such as India, Indonesia, Burma. Yugoslavia was the only European country as the member of that movement, Middle Eastern and later African countries. The process of decolonization led to their regional gathering and joint appearance on the international stage. After the meeting of Tito, Nasser of Egypt, and Nehru, Prime Minister of India, on Brion Island in 1956, and their common presentation at the 15th General Assembly of the United Nations, cooperation among non-aligned countries gained a universal global dimension. That's a big turnout. They didn't limit themselves to solving local and regional problems in Asia and Africa, but also focus on fighting for radical change in current international relations. One of the main principles of non-aligned movement countries was to oppose Eastern and Western blocs as a means of preserving their national independence, self-determination, and right to decide their future development. Several factors define the non-aligned policy of non-aligned countries. I will distinguish only two because I think they're most important. The first one is decolonization. Non-aligned first appeared in newly decolonized countries after the World War II. After this colonization and liberation of their countries, they asked themselves, what will be our next step? How we will improve our economy, develop our economy, how we will industrialize our society. And the solution of the problems they found in actively working on radical change in current international relations. The second reason is undeveloped economies, because they were all undeveloped. And these two main factors was actually the most influential, but the Cold War at that time was only, I wouldn't say that that was the cause of non-aligned movement or foundation of the movement, but is more some stimulating factor who contributed foundation to this movement. If the members became part of any blocs, Eastern or Western, they would be denying their very reason for existence and foundation. The non-aligned movement appeared as the antithesis of the politics of big powers. The main principle of the non-aligned movement is politics of neutrality. And that means to support each country which advocates for world peace, not to be part of any blocs, but to cooperate with them. Actively peaceful coexistence and cooperation among countries with different social and political systems, opposition to imperialism and colonialism, respect of the sovereignty and integrity of all countries, respect of human rights formulated in the Charter of the United Nations, non-involvement in the domestic affairs of other countries, and solving problems among countries in a peaceful way. These principles were formulated at the conference in Bandung, Indonesia, with 29 countries in April 1955. Because of the position of Yugoslavia between Eastern and Western blocs, Tito thought that he could secure the national independence of Yugoslavia and its communist regime through the non-aligned movement. And in April 1950, Tito expressed these key points of the Yugoslav foreign policy, which actually overlap, is the same like the main principle of non-aligned movement. In the early 1950s, Yugoslavia started to establish self-governing socialism, which was a different economic model of socialism from the Eastern Bloc, and the cause for Yugoslavia's intention to be part of the movement. As a non-aligned country, Yugoslavia found a possibility for independent development and a way out of isolation between two blocs after 1948. Dragan Bogić claims that the main initiator of opening Yugoslavia to third world countries was Josip Broz. He was a Yugoslavian ambassador to India in 1950 and 1951, but not Tito. He was sending reports from India to Yugoslavia's government about possible cooperation with India and Burma. Tito and Kardelj, who was a foreign minister of Yugoslavia, liked these Broz ideas, but it wasn't time when Yugoslavia wanted to publicly expose the ideas of third world countries because of the aid it was then receiving from the West. Yugoslavia repaired its relationship with the Soviet Union during the Khrushchev presidency. At that time, Tito went to India and Burma at the end of 1954 and beginning of 1955. And Tito's trip to India and Burma was actually the major breakthrough in establishing the non-aligned movement. Tito was introduced to Nehru and Nasser in Egypt, after which they had frequent meetings. In conversation with them, Tito absorbed the principles of non-aligned policy and how this policy was actually exported to Europe and Yugoslavia. Tito hosted a meeting with Nasser and Nehru on Brion Island in July 1955. They issued a declaration confirming the same foundation principle of the non-aligned movement, but different with universal and global dimension. During its existence, the non-aligned movement had a lot of disagreements and conflict because a lot of countries belonged to that movement. A culmination of these conflicts, it happened during the 1970s. That was more concrete in their summit in Havana in 1979. That was a conflict between countries who supported Cuba and Yugoslavia. In practically, that was the conflict between Tito and Castro. Cuba considered the non-aligned movement to be more close to Eastern Bloc because they share the same policies. Castro claimed that both blocs cannot be equal because the Western Bloc is the cause of all crises in the world, while the Soviet Bloc is the foundation of all peace and security. For this reason, this movement should be close to the Soviet Union and be naturally allied with it. On the contrary, Tito claimed the non-aligned movement is close. If it is close to the Soviet Union, it would position the non-aligned countries against the West. They would become part of one bloc, which wasn't the goal of the movement. Tito, as the only still alive founder at that conference, already died, Nasser and Nehru, Tito was the only alive. He insisted on the main principle of the foundation of the movement, solidarity and peaceful coexistence among nations. Tito died next year in 1980, and according to the Western media, Tito's idea actually won at that summit in Havana because the majority participants supported Tito's ideas. Yugoslavia existed as a socialist country because of Western funding and could be one reason why Tito opposed Castro's approach to non-aligned movement. Henry Kissinger's letter to Richard Nixon about his visit to Yugoslavia said, "In the prevailing Yugoslav life and politics for 25 years, Tito often tended to assign to his country a role completely disproportionate to its size, position, and capabilities. His non-aligned world and his conferences seem to have reached some coherence and strength. The important non-aligned role for Yugoslavia, as well as the fact that it is the part of luxury that depends on American power." Kissinger mentioned Nixon's previous visit to Sixth Fleet as a possible sensitive topic in the talks and said, "Tito knows what is important for his own security." After Tito's death in 1980, the non-aligned movement didn't have the same kind of political cohesion within the movement, which diminished its importance in the world. After the Cold War, the movement began to fade because it couldn't sustain its existence with a universal value which Yugoslavia advocated, but became a regional movement focusing on regional problems. One of Tito's main ideas was insisting on the principle of quantity, not quality, in membership with many countries, because he thought that with a larger number of countries, the movement would be stronger and more influential on the international stage and better able to impose its view. At the Belgrade conference, it was present 25 countries, but in Havana in 1979 was 92 countries. The non-aligned movement didn't succeed because of declarative policies and no action to organize participants around economic unity to make them stronger. They were not able to solve their economic issues without cooperation with the blocs. Many times they were not realistic in their expectation, such as in their economic forum in developed countries. However, the benefit of the movement was in reducing the conflicts between two blocs during the Cold War. The movement placed more pressure on both blocs to negotiate. Their influence was felt on the global stage in that way. And something at the end I want to stress that I think that's important, and that's what we can learn from this movement during the Cold War. We can learn more about today's international relations and not minimize the potential of such movement as West did in the early years of the non-aligned movement. Today, the BRICS, founded in 2009, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and this year joined Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates. Organization has the same goal as the principle as the non-aligned movement, but with more advantages. BRICS consist of more economically and militarily powerful countries such as Russia, China, and India. If the US and the West neglect this association, it would come back to haunt them in the future international relations. BRICS is expanding as a reaction to globalization. Why? Because this is the only place where nations not interested in participating in a new Cold War, nor in any possible hot war between the superpower can escape, so they don't have to choose side. The fact that an increasing number of countries want to join BRICS cannot be ignored or taken lightly. The economic impact of BRICS can help reduce some of the glaring economic imbalances between rich and poor countries or developed and undeveloped countries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the Cold War Studies Seminar at Harvard and his director, Mark Kramer, for inviting me to take part in today's seminar, and the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies for hosting me as a visiting scholar and as a center associate, providing an excellent atmosphere for my research. I'm honored to offer my thoughts and assessment today of Soviet-Yugoslav relations during the Cold War and especially during the Tito's era. And I will start my talk by sharing with you two quotations, one from a historian and author and another from a CIA document on the topic that helps today us discuss the various aspects of the peculiar relations between the two countries. Roy Allison, in the late 80s, described in his book his vision, saying, Tito used Yugoslavia's non-alignment to increase the scope and latitude of the country's foreign relations, to resist Soviet pressures to integrate politically into the East European bloc. The important role of the Yugoslav Federation in the international system was repeatedly evaluated by CIA experts, as Miloš said, especially in the context of its relations with Moscow. In 1983, we have analysis from CIA, and in the report, we read the following. Yugoslavia's strategic importance rests on its status as an independent state, capable of facilitation or impeding Soviet access to the Adriatic and the Mediterranean. Although communist in orientation and occasionally troublesome in its support of third world liberation movements, the regime in Belgrade has made independence of Soviet dictates its top priority since 1948. The Soviets recognized these facts only grudgingly, but were able to prevent Yugoslavia from building up its economic ties with the prosperous West. So now let me focus on few topics. Of course, this period from 1948 until 1980, because I'm only focusing on Tito's era. It is very interesting, but I would like to stress only on Soviet Yugoslav relations, if it's possible. And Miloš helped me a lot with his talk, showing us the meaning of non-alignment and the place of Yugoslavia during that period on the international stage. So I'd like also to say that my presentation is based primarily on declassified documents from various archives, from Russian archives, from Yugoslav archives, and US archives, as well as on highly regarded historical books, which some of them I will mention. So during Tito's rule, Yugoslavia won a place in international policy and was quite often qualified as the pet kid of East and the West, a position that the Federation gradually lost after 1980 and especially after 1989. The conclusion from CIA report in 1983 that Yugoslavia under Tito's leadership enjoyed increasing prosperity, relative calm at home, and a widely recognized role as a leading non-aligned nation was fully acceptable, I think, and accurate for characterizing Yugoslavia during Tito's rule. I will touch on the following key issues. The state of relations between the two countries in 50s, already Miloš started, and with this topic, so maybe I'll skip it, I'll see. The relations between Moscow and Belgrade after Yugoslavia became one of the leaders of non-aligned movements in early 60s. I will also touch the Warsaw Pact countries in the Warsaw Pact countries in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Belgrade's position. The perception in Moscow of Yugoslavia's position as a non-aligned country in the 70s, although Miloš covered in depth already this topic, but I think I will present the Soviet view on the Yugoslav non-aligned policy. in the 70s, and the attempts of to rapprochement in 70s that led to better relations, those better relations primarily in economic sphere. If maybe I will leave that issue for the discussion. I also wanted to touch upon US policy to Yugoslavia as one of the important leaders of non-alignment movement, and how Washington policy affected the changes in Moscow's perception of Belgrade and brought changes in Soviet policy towards Yugoslavia in the 1970s. So Yugoslavia, as Miloš already mentioned, became the first dissident in the Eastern Bloc when in 1948, Tito refused to obey the dictate given by Stalin and the Cominform, Communist Information Bureau. The accusations against the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which was also expelled from Cominform on the 28th of June 1948, were severe. They included a wide range of accusation or of derogation from the principles of Marxist-Leninist system and of the proletarian internationalism, manifestation of nationalism, another accusation, strong opposition to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's leadership, and the pursuit of policy incompatible with that of states with so-called people's democracy, and others. Nikita Khrushchev writes in his memoirs that, quote, "We ourselves have spoken and criticized the Yugoslavs and characterized them with epithets that they were revisionists, apostates of the Marxist-Leninist theory, etc." End of quote. And Tito was described as the hero of any anti-socialist, anti-communist viruses. The deep divide between Stalin and Tito has been studied by many Yugoslav, Soviet, European, and American authors. And it's still a very interesting topic. The consequences for Yugoslavia of the breakup with Moscow were long-lasting. They were not only of political and ideological dimension, but also economical, because not only do they lead to diplomatic and political isolation of Yugoslavia from the USSR and countries with people's democracy, but they also directly affected the economy of the Federation, which was left alone, isolated from the socialist camp. In these unfavorable foreign policy circumstances, it was natural for the leadership of Yugoslavia to seek opportunities for sustaining economic life through more economic ties and assistance with countries beyond the Iron Curtain, specifically from the developed Western European countries, and especially with the United States of America, as already Miloš mentioned and stated in his talk. So without dwelling too much on the nature and specifics of the trade relations between Yugoslavia and the USSR, we may say that assisting the Yugoslav state with alternative sources of military supplies helped to preserve the traditional Yugoslav independent policy position, thus serving to promote the US interests. This does not mean that the US administration regarded Yugoslavia as its military ally, except when Yugoslavia was threatened by the Warsaw Pact, for example, in 1968. Even then, there is no clear indication of possible action of defense of Yugoslavia by the United States and NATO countries, as was expressed in the NATO declaration of 1963. The first time when we can speak about a revision of Moscow's position on Yugoslavia this is the time after the death of Stalin in 1953, and the visit of the government delegation of Yugoslavia to the USSR, as it was already mentioned, in June 1956, marks an important milestone in the history of Soviet-Yugoslav relations. This is a very important meeting. This is the first meeting of the Yugoslav Government Party delegation in the USSR, which lasts for almost 3 weeks, from June 1st to June 23rd, 1956. The delegation was headed, as already mentioned, by Josip Broz Tito. And during that lengthy visit, extremely important documents regarding the future of bilateral cooperation between the states were drafted. Among these documents was the declaration of the relations between the two parties, signed by Mikuyan and the Slovenian national Edvard Kardel, who possessed the authority of the ideologies of Tito's Yugoslavia. It is interesting to note that it was Mikuyan himself in 1948 who, by order of Stalin, among other members of Politburo, participated in the drafting of letters addressed to the Yugoslav leader, accusing him of apostasy from the ideas of Marxism and other hostile actions towards Tito. After Stalin's death, it was Mikuyan who was tasked to work toward warming up of the Soviet-Yugoslav relations. So the beginning of the warming of the relations was set during that the visit of the end of May and the beginning of June, which was led by Nikita Khrushchev, and Mikuyan also participated in it. Despite the disagreements, the joint declaration of the restoration of interstate relations between USSR and Yugoslavia was eventually signed in June 1956. On Yugoslavia's side, the task of preparing those documents was given to Edvard Kardel. In Moscow, it was accepted that the issue of reconciliation with Yugoslavia must be brought to the attention of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's Central Committee. The differences in position between Mikuyan and Molotov were mainly related to the views of Molotov, who did not accept Yugoslavia as a socialist state. And therefore, it was inappropriate to exercise towards it a policy different from that towards an ordinary capitalist state, quote. Subsequently, the issue of Soviet-Yugoslav relations was included in the agenda of the plenum of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's Central Committee, which took place in early July, between 4th and 12th of July, 1955. And the difference in the position of senior party figures on the policy towards Yugoslavia shows the new trends in Soviet foreign policy, and Mikuyan becomes a major advocate for the improvement of Soviet-Yugoslav relations. At the same time, the fact that leading figures such as Molotov can accept the Yugoslavia as a non-aligned state can only be regarded as a, quote, an ordinary capitalist state, end of quote, shows that Moscow had more of a distanced position during that period, as well as that Yugoslavia as a non-aligned state was not regarded as an exception to the general Moscow policy towards non-aligned states at the time. So let me move to 1960s. A few words about relations between Yugoslavia and USSR. So in the early 1960s, there was a new improvement in Belgrade-Moscow relations. It was connected, in one hand, with the processes taking place in the USSR, and on the other hand, with the processes in the world with which the USSR had to confront its foreign policy line, including with respect to Yugoslavia. At the same time, internal factors also playing an important role. The reassessment of the foreign policy course during the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee was of major political importance. Yugoslavia accepts the decisions of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee regarding the condemnation of the cult of personality, as well as the adoption of different avenues for building socialism. But at the same time, Yugoslavia did not send an official delegation at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee, with only the Yugoslav ambassador presented as an observer, which was perceived in Moscow as distancing of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia from the world's communist movement. Even then, Tito sent his greetings to the Congress, which was published in Pravda newspaper. Belgrade apparently feared that excessive rapprochement with Moscow can harm the unaligned policy ran by Belgrade at that time. As Milos already mentioned, in 1961, Belgrade was already among the leading factors in non-aligned movement, only European country. At the same time, the special treatment of Yugoslavia stems not only from its unaligned policy, but rather from the re-evaluation of Moscow's role in the international relations, and specifically towards states that adopt a socialist course of development different than the Moscow one. I prepared a very short commentary on the USSR and its policy towards Yugoslavia non-alignment. So I won't speak about non-alignment per se, but with this angle, should I do it now, Mark, or should I?
You can do it.
Yeah. So this will be the angle that I'm going to input. I hope this will be input for the whole presentation for our seminar. So because my colleague Milos already discussed in depth the topic of non-alignment, what does it mean? What does it mean, non-alignment policy? I will just make a few statements. I fully agree, I would say, with Dragan Bogetic's perception. Dragan Bogetic is a leading historian and scholar of non-alignment. And he was actually, I had a meeting with him a few years ago, just before the pandemic. And he was among a few people who got access to the documents of the Ministry of Foreign Relations in Yugoslavia. Yes, and he told me, you won't be able to get access to those documents, but of course I got access to his books. So I fully agree with Professor Dragan Bogetic's perception, who pictures several main stages in the Soviet policy towards non-alignment. Referring to party and state documents at the USSR, Bogetic outlines the main characteristics of the Soviet view towards the non-alignment policy. Bogetic's systematization is based on the theoretical model of Soviet science, on the specifics of non-alignment, and on the goals of the Soviet foreign policy. Due to the importance of the systematization, I think, proposed by Bogetic, I think who outlined main stages in the Soviet policy to non-alignment, I think it will be helpful for us to clarify, as Milos said, knowing non-alignment and the meaning of non-alignment helps us to explain Yugoslav foreign policy, but also the attitudes of the main political factors of the superpowers also at that time towards Yugoslavia. So that's why non-alignment topic is so important at that time and also until today. So knowing this classification will help us to clarify to some extent the complicated Yugoslav relations, and especially the period after the divide between Moscow and Belgrade during 1948. So the first stage of this period, I will go very quickly, covers the period of the events after the Second World War until the death of Stalin in 1953. During this period, the Soviet concept of the nature of international relations was that the world was divided into two antagonistic camps, socialist and imperialist. According to this view, any country that was known in the socialist camp was automatically regarded as imperialist country. According to Bugetić, after the failure of the USSR's attempt to add to its bloc the states that were just freeing themselves from colonial rule at that time, the Soviet Union, this is a quote from Bugetić, the Soviet Union moved away from the newly liberated lands and showed no interest in communication with them. This is end of quote. This is confirmed by the fact that in 1950, during the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of USSR, there wasn't even a word on a matter of establishing friendly relations with these newly independent states. According to Dragan Bukesh's assessment, this fact indicates that in the USSR, there was no clear understanding of the new content of the international relations on one hand, and on the other hand, in Moscow, the movements of national liberation were understood only as a manifestation of the, quote, exacerbation of the crisis of the colonial system of imperialism, end of quote. The only positive assessment of these movements, liberation movements, in 60s, especially in 60s and 70s, was in relation of the perception that they were manifestations that contribute to the weakening of imperialism, with no consideration given to the importance that they had for the oppressed people. Because of this dogmatic and sectarian view, the Soviet thinking left no room for newly liberated states to pursue independent foreign policy outside the existing two blocs. Therefore, there was no attention given to any attempts at non-aligned policies. This understanding is characteristic of the Soviet theory on international relations at that time, which did not examine the foreign policy of states that did not belong to any of the existing blocs. The theoretical framework of the non-alignment policy also evolved during the various stages of the development of the Soviet-Yugoslav relations, as already Miloš mentioned in his talk. It involved also in Moscow, when in 60s Nikita Khrushchev reported on the ruling communist presidium, special plenum of the Soviet Union, and the presidium. He mentioned, quote, for the first time, a conflict leading to serious military clashes had arisen between a socialist and neutralist country. So new wording is coming in Soviet foreign policy. So here in late 60s, I would like to mention just with a few words the impact that 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia had on Yugoslav Soviet relations. So following the improvement in Soviet-Yugoslav relations, a period of the divergences in position on various issues of international politics follows again. The invasion by Warsaw Pact states in Prague in 1968 caused major blow to the bilateral relations. It is accepted among scholars that this was the cause for the Third Soviet-Yugoslav conflict after the Second World War. Belgrade reacted strongly against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and it was met with extreme criticism in various circles in Yugoslavia, among state and party circles, as well as among different sections of the population. The actions of the states participating in the Warsaw Treaty Organization troops were characterized as a violent interference in the internal affairs of an independent state. The reaction of Yugoslavia provoked backlash in Moscow, which led to a strain in both political relations and inter-party relations. There are several major factors in Yugoslavia that have led to this kind of relations. They can be divided into two main categories: factors foreign to Yugoslavia and internal considerations. The vocal response to the invasion of Yugoslavia was provoked by more than motives for adherence to the international norms of behavior on the international stage in Yugoslav's case. The vocal reaction was also caused by fears in Yugoslav ruling circles and society that there was a threat to their national security and sovereignty of the state. These concerns were strengthened by the military maneuvers of the Warsaw Pact organization close to the borders of the Federation and the presence of ships from the Soviet Navy in the Mediterranean Sea. According to Russian experts, the fears in Yugoslavia of a potential, Soviet experts, I apologize, the fears in Yugoslavia of a potential threat were reflected in the doctrine of restrained sovereignty, quote, known as Brezhnev doctrine, used by both Yugoslav and Western media. And many Western authors came to similar conclusions. For example, according to Warren Zimmerman, the issue of events in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and the Soviet Union had strong reflection on Yugoslav affairs. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia was seen as ominous and threatening in Yugoslavia. Changes in 1968 in Czechoslovakia were viewed in Yugoslavia truly in the direction of a socialism with a human face, these Soviet sources. The Prague Spring found much of its inspiration in Yugoslav market socialism and was demonstrably supported by Tito. The invasion in Czechoslovakia led by Moscow convinced Yugoslavia that main danger to Yugoslav security stemmed from the Soviet Union. It also reconfirmed the wisdom of being a part of the international system rather than part of Eastern Europe. So this explains the active role of Yugoslavia in the non-aligned movement. It created the notion that emergence of Soviet Union as a world power with global force projection capabilities has called into question whether in Soviet minds the world has become, so to speak, Eastern Europe. Therefore, the invasion, I'll conclude with this because I was given 1 minute. Therefore, the invasion of 5?
No, I said 5 minutes ago.
Oh. Therefore, the invasion of Czechoslovakia under the leadership of Moscow resulted in the heightened fear of the Yugoslav party and state leadership of the possible invasion of Yugoslav territory. The invasion also questioned, according to, this is a quote from a document, at the verbal level, the issue is whether the Soviet Union will show, in the words of Belgrade Declaration, respect for the sovereignty, independence, integrity, and equality of states in their relations with each other, and therefore not interfere in Yugoslav internal affairs. So these fears and considerations were accounted in documents in the American archives as well. And Should I stop here?
That's fine. Sure.
Yeah, no, I still have left seventies. But maybe I'll leave the seventies for
If you-
discussion
If it comes up.
if it comes up. Thank you very much for your
Okay,
attention.
very good.
All right, so let me, before opening it, let me just offer a couple of quick comments. I'm very glad that Nadia touched on the impact of the 1968 crisis on Yugoslavia, when both Yugoslavia and Romania was a member of the Warsaw Pact, but nonetheless took a strong stance against the Soviet-led invasion. Tito and Ceausescu actually met on a few occasions during the crisis, and Tito, I think, expected more from Ceausescu than he ultimately got. He thought that they could actually form a separate bloc that would take a stand against both the Soviet Union and its invasion of Czechoslovakia, and then also against the West. And Tito was certainly supporting the forces in North Vietnam that were fighting the United States. So it's not that he was doing what he had done in the early 50s when he began making overtures to a NATO during Stalin's lifetime. And both speakers rightly noted the impact of Stalin's death on Yugoslav foreign policy. During the period from June 1948 through March 1953, the Soviet Union was gearing up for an invasion of Yugoslavia in conjunction with its East European allies. There was no Warsaw Pact at the time, but they were all operating under very close Soviet direction, but that included Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, all of which would have played leading roles in the invasion under Soviet auspices. As soon as Stalin died, his successors made this effort to seek a rapprochement with Yugoslavia. It was included in resolutions adopted just after Stalin's death, secretly adopted that just after Stalin's death. And as both speakers mentioned, there were very rapid overtures to try to improve the relationship. The meetings in Belgrade and that Miloš touched on in Belgrade in May 1955, and then that Nadia discussed in Moscow in June 1956. All of those did bring about a very significant improvement of relations. One point I should add about 1956 is Khrushchev, in his secret speech at the 20th Soviet Party Congress, quite sharply criticized Stalin's policy toward Yugoslavia, and implicitly also criticized Molotov as part of it. So that political competition in Moscow during that time, with Khrushchev trying to really discredit Molotov, played a significant role, as well as in the improvement of the Soviet Union's relations with Yugoslavia. One thing, though, in 1956 that arose was in early November, just after the Soviet Presidium, as the Politburo was known, had decided to launch a full-scale invasion of Hungary. Tito hosted both Khrushchev and Malenkov on Brioni during a stormy, very stormy early November evening. And he actually, contrary to what Khrushchev had expected, he thought that Tito was going to oppose the invasion, or at least object to it quite strongly. On the contrary, Tito actually gave his consent for the invasion. He was a communist and was frightened about what was going on in Hungary and didn't want it potentially to spread to Yugoslavia. So he actually gave his consent to the invasion, even though later on in public he was critical of it, at least mildly critical of it. He never certainly condemned it the way he did later on the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. One last point that I just want to raise is with regard to the non-aligned movement. It was the product of both, as I think Milos mentioned, it wasn't just the Cold War that brought it about. It was the product of two major forces that were connected but were separate also, which was the Cold War and then the process of decolonization. And so the non-aligned movement emerged from those two concurrent processes, even though they were not directly connected, they very much overlapped, and that the Soviet Union provided extensive assistance to insurgent groups and decolonization movements that opposed the West. And that meant that within the non-aligned movement, there was always this tension between should it become an anti-Western movement, an overtly anti-Western movement. Two of the founders of it, India and Yugoslavia, were not entirely happy with that orientation, whereas the third founder, Egypt, under Nasser, did really have that in mind, at least to a degree. Later on, as Milos mentioned, that tension arose much more directly between Yugoslavia and Cuba, which was very strongly aligned with the Soviet Union. And it made a mockery of the non-aligned movement to have Cuba cheering it in the late 1970s. And that was overtly criticized not only by the Yugoslavs, but by other members, some other members of the non-aligned movement. But that tension between the extent to which it should have this sharply anti-Western orientation was there until throughout the existence of the non-aligned movement from 1961 on. And that's where I'll end, is just to say, that's where I didn't quite understand the analogy with BRICS today, and that the two major members of BRICS wanted to be, very determined to have it be an anti-Western bloc to try to undermine Western preponderance in the international order. That is the two leading members, China and Russia. There are, and it's also one of the new members, Iran, has very much that same orientation. There are other members, certainly India, which is in this odd grouping with two major rivals, China and so forth. But still, the overall BRICS has, because its two leading members are so profoundly committed to undermining the Western international order, I don't really see it as analogous to the non-aligned movement. I see it as something, quite different, and in that sense is much more like, say, the Warsaw Pact. Not a perfect analogy, but is something like an organization that is overtly seeking to oppose Western dominance in the world. In a way that the non-aligned movement, some members of the non-aligned movement wanted to do it, but most members or a significant number of members of the non-aligned movement, including Yugoslavia, wanted it simply to be an organization between East and West. Okay, so let me, if either of you wants to comment on any of that, otherwise I'm just going to open it for questions. Why don't I open it for questions and then you can comment on everything. So please. Yes.
How serious was Russian plans to invade Yugoslavia? It seems almost like a ridiculous.
What period have you done?
Oh, I mean, let's say between 45 and 50.
Well, 45 to 48, Tito was staunchly allied with the Soviet Union. Milos mentioned that he was an ardent Stalinist during that time. Soviet Union. Stalin decided to rein in the Yugoslavia, and from 1948 through March 1953, there were very significant preparations for an invasion. It doesn't necessarily mean that Stalin would have launched an invasion if he had died longer, but he was certainly laying the capacity for it. I find it. Given the extent of the preparations, I find it likely that he would have tried to use military force to bring Yugoslavia back into the bloc. But let me offer the chance to both of the speakers to say what they.
Oh, okay. The BRICS is very interesting subject if we want to talk about that. And I appreciate that Dr. Kramer mentioned that subject. When I analyze both non-aligned movement and BRICS, I found the same, absolutely the same principles, non-alignment and the BRICS, that is decolonization that we can see now in Africa and other parts of the world, that is peaceful coexistence. They don't want any hegemony. And practically these principles are absolutely the same. And even from the representative of these countries, I didn't hear that they said that the Western Bloc is their enemy. I think that what they want, they don't want to impose your will to anybody. They want to be equal in their partnership. That's what these countries, as it was in the past with non-aligned movement, that's the same situation today. During the non-aligned movement, it was, and actually Yugoslavia proposed that body, that was the Bureau of Coordination, that was the first permanent body of the non-aligned movement in the United Nations. They had one president and 14 vice presidents, and Tito was one of them. And their main idea was to change the current international relation, that all these rich countries can give more to the poor countries. And of course, that couldn't work. Any developed country didn't want to share really too much to others, especially that was in the early 1970s. And if you remember, that was Richard Nixon was the president at that time, and United States was in big crisis. That was practically United States didn't have any backup for dollar, and then they switched to the petrodollar. And that was a very difficult time for United States, and they were not ready to negotiate about these subjects. And today, with the BRICS, actually, I think they can achieve more than non-aligned movement, because they have in their line more powerful countries like China, the most developed economy, Russia, and they can more negotiate with other undeveloped countries to get more. And in that sense, China is offer more to these countries because they offer loans to these countries. There is no any political conditions for that, like you can get from the International Monetary Fund or World Bank. And those countries in Africa and Asia are more free to take that money and build their infrastructure and everything what they need. That's why, in that sense, that perspective is more close to non-aligned movement. They protect their integrity, sovereignty of the countries, equality, everything what non-aligned movement wanted to achieve. But they were not so powerful that they can do that. Now with the BRICS, they have more chance at least to get something. And what I mentioned, this imbalance between rich and poor countries, or developed and undeveloped countries, can reduce. That was the main point.
Okay. I mean, the non-aligned movement didn't have the function of providing investment for members, but I think you presented a sort of a Chinese version of BRICS, the perspective on BRICS, which it sees Chinese economic assistance to various countries as entirely benign, and depicting it as not connected with political concessions, which at least on the ground doesn't really hold up. Whether it's in Africa or in South Asia, the Chinese have actually attached very significant restrictions on aid that not directly tied to political concessions, but certainly indirectly are. Russia as well, in Central African Republic and numerous other African countries, has established relationships that I would broadly describe as colonial. So some of that was carried out by the Wagner Group before the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, but it continues to be proceed in the same way under Prigozhin's successor. So, I mean, I see BRICS as really very different from the non-aligned movement. However, this is not a seminar about BRICS. So let me, if you want to comment with regard to the question, or if Nadia wants to comment on the question.
But on theoretical level, if you compare both non-aligned movement and the BRICS, they're absolutely the same principles on theoretical level.
Yeah, but the leading challenger to Western dominance now is China. China is a member of BRICS. The Soviet Union wasn't a member of the non-aligned. So I just don't see the analogy. But okay, Nikolai.
Yes, I wanted to go back to the non-alignment movement, and I'd like to know something more about the US. If the researchers have looked at some American documents, either classified or declassified, the attitude of the American government towards the non-alignment movement. And one more question, which would be very interesting. Yugoslavia and non-aligned countries had arms trade with, I guess, mostly with the Soviet bloc. But I would like to know if you know something more. If you can elaborate something more on this.
About Soviet.
I would like to know if you are aware of the arms trade. Where do those countries from the non-alignment countries got their arms, either from the Soviet bloc or?
But Yugoslavia got from United States and NATO during the 50s, 1950s.
Yugoslavia also had the Kalashnikovs, right?
Yeah, they had also,
They had both.
yes,
It was like in different periods.
Right.
different periods, depends.
But they still had the armament. They did not reorganize.
They still,
had those arms until the end of the 90s, because in
Yes.
the 90s the wars were led
Yes,
with
yes. They still had the same weapons, yes. I was in the army at that time, and that was really very old weapons, almost unusable. I wasn't surprised when the Yugoslav army fell apart because I spent 1 year there and I saw that cannot exist. That really.
But-
Yeah,
But as Milos mentioned, you know, the Yugoslavia did buy arms from both the
Yes.
United States and
Yes.
Britain in
Yes.
the early 50s, up as he mentioned until 1957.
That's what
Flavia ended.
I think.
But it did, you know, because it was equipped up until that time, had been entirely equipped with Soviet-made weapons. It did continue after in the 60s and 70s to buy spare parts from Moscow. So you know, again, it varied from period to period, but so that's why it still had some of those Soviet. But
here the answer is that Yugoslavia used every opportunity to gain as much as the leadership to gain as much as they could from the Western European countries and from the United States and from Soviet Union, and they were just playing on international arena, and they're using very skillfully, I would say, especially during Tito's era, the place of Yugoslavia on the map, and also the place of Yugoslavia as a non-aligned country. And they were using this dealing with the United States of America and the Soviet Union. So, for example, after 1968, that was another crisis in the Soviet-Yugoslav relations. But after that, in the early 70s, the two countries, the two states made considerable efforts to take concrete active steps for the improvement of their relations, with each side guided by its own national interest. For the Yugoslav state, the considerations of national security had a leading role. So along with this motive, other important considerations were the continuation of trade agreements, credit agreements, and the maintenance of military cooperation. And this is citation from documents. So consequently, although the invasion of the Soviet troops into Czechoslovakia in 1968 caused a very serious strain in the Moscow-Belgrade relations, the USSR did not suspend military supplies to Yugoslavia. So on political relations, diplomatic relations is one thing, but when it comes to arms supply and the trade, here I wanted to mention the factor that United States supported. They used any opportunity to support Tito and the Yugoslav government. So because I'm not sure that they thought that Yugoslavia can be taken out of its way of non-alignment socialist state or whatever at that time they claimed. But it was a matter of competition between USSR and the USA, you know, where Yugoslavia should belong. So Yugoslavia used the position very skillfully. And there are many others. So I also, when I started my dissertation on American policy towards the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, so of course I dealt with the American policy towards Yugoslavia during the whole period of the Cold War, and I was amazed using I found so many data about supply, also our supply, any kind of supply in form of it was help, but it was, you know, help from the United States government and Western governments, but especially from the United States government. In other words, they were loans, but those loans were calculated in a way that, in other words, Yugoslavia would never give back what it was given as a gift. Not as a gift, of course, it wasn't called gift, but so the calculation of those loans was very strange. I'm not going to go into details, but so both superpowers during the Cold War used every opportunity to bring Yugoslavia on their side for the moment. But of course, situation changed and very quickly changed. Several times changed.
Okay, please, here and I can, please.
When did things change with the most of the products we see now coming into this country are made in China? When did that happen and why?
What?
That the United States has there's not as many products made in the United States now as in China.
Thomas Piketty, he's a French political economist. He explained that very well that happened in early 80s during the Margaret Thatcher in the Great Britain and during the Ronald Reagan here. That was some kind of conservative revolution. And what they did, they say, we don't want to produce anymore. We will import everything to China and Asia because there is no need that we work anymore. We will have cheap labor there. Yes. And that's what happened. Yes. And they cut the taxes. That's why we today don't produce anything here except the weapons. That's the only industry that we have. And we are very dependent on China, fortunately.
Okay, let me just, the key change came about in China through Deng Xiaoping, who decided when Mao Zedong died in 1976, China was still one of the world's poorest countries per capita, and it was extremely poor. It had lost about 35 million people to starvation in the late 50s and early 60s because of Mao's policies. And when he died, he basically, up until that time, had kept the Chinese economy closed. Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s made the momentous decision to open China, first to decollectivize agriculture and then to open China to the world economy, the international economy. And so that's, it was because of that China gradually began not only to grow economically, but also to have the extensive trade that it developed in the 1980s and especially the 1990s with Western countries. Yeah, China does have or did have, no, not so much now, but did have very low labor costs. And that was part of what contributed to the surge of, it wasn't a conscious decision by Reagan and Thatcher to have China take over. It may have been partly a consequence of certain policies, free trade, which overall is a very good policy. But there weren't sufficient precautions taken, perhaps, but it was very much driven by China's own decisions and actions. Please.
Hi, thank you very much. I have two questions. Sorry, one is, was there then anything peculiar to Serbia? In other words, can one draw a direct line or a dotted line from Serbia and its relations today with China, I guess in part because we bombed their embassy, and its relations with Moscow today from back then, although you have addressed a lot about relations with Moscow during that period. The other one is, what was the role of the neutral countries, Finland, Sweden, and Austria, in all of this? Is sort of a different shade of gray, I guess.
Well, if you look at Serbia today, if you're interested in that subject, Serbia practically have the same policy as during the former Yugoslavia, which means neutral policy. Yugoslavia, I think the only country in Europe who is not EU member, is not NATO member, and the only country that didn't sanction Russia, which Serbia proves that it's a neutral country. Switzerland, for instance, is officially a neutral country, but they sanctioned Russia, which actually it shouldn't happen. Neutral country cannot sanction anybody if you want to stay neutral country. That's happened with Finland, I think, that they're not neutral anymore. If you want to be neutral, like the former Yugoslavia, you have to work with everybody. And that's how you preserve your neutrality. You want to friends with everybody and to work with whoever you want. Because you're a small country and you have to find your position in this world. And what was the second part?
Well,
The bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999.
Yeah, what about that?
Whether
Well,
that contributes to the relationship between Serbia and China, or it affects the relationship.
But probably there is influence on the relationship between Serbia and China today. But the relationship between Serbia and China started to build, that was during the 1990s, and Milosevic was the president. He started to build this relationship with China, and during the time, this relationship became stronger and stronger, and now China is an economic partner to Serbia at very good instances. And I think he's today in Belgrade, I think. Yes, if I...
And he's going to visit this site.
Yes.
Because it's being bombed.
Yeah, that's why he came there, yes, to visit that site.
Yeah, no, it's still often cited, and again, it was a appalling, error by NATO forces involved in the embassy. So it's not surprising that it continues to resonate, both in real sentiment, but also in propaganda. So it does affect relations, as you suggest. But it also is often cited by Russian commentators because Russia opposed, I think rightly opposed the war in Kosovo, so Russian propagandists also continue to cite the bombing of the embassy as indicative of NATO's larger malevolence, I guess.
I think, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I think how China look at in Serbia, because Serbia or Hungary and any other countries in that region, they're small countries for China.
I'm gonna get something to answer
And
your second.
what they
question.
look at on Serbia more from economic perspective. Serbia, besides Hungary, these two countries are actually the only countries that the China plan to import, actually to export their goods to EU. That's how they look at Serbia and Hungary from that economic perspective. That's the prevailing one for China.
But in answer to your second question there about the role of the neutral countries, this book, which I'm lead editor, the Soviet Union and Cold War Neutrality and Non-Alignment in Europe includes chapters, including one by Nadia on Yugoslavia and its role in Soviet foreign policy, but also all the other major neutral countries, Switzerland, Sweden, Finland. Sweden and Finland now, as Milos mentioned, have joined NATO, but Switzerland has not. Switzerland did join the United Nations in 2000, but otherwise has stayed outside the European Union and other such organizations. It is a member of the Council of Europe, but that's it. Sweden, Finland, and Austria all joined the European Union. Austria has not joined NATO, but so it's not, it's not as much neutral as say Serbia is, but it is somewhat similar in that regard. It's not joining NATO. Serbia does have, along with Turkey, does have the distinction of not having enforced sanctions against Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. Because other countries that have, Switzerland has enforced sanctions, Austria has enforced sanctions, and so forth. So it stands out.
And during the Cold War period, did those countries have a role? I mean, an important role, or?
Yeah, they did. I mean, it's certainly in the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, they played important roles. That's discussed in various chapters in the book. And but also the non-aligned movement, as both Milos and Nadia have discussed, was something that the Soviet Union took seriously, wanted to manipulate it in its favor, and succeeded to a degree in the late 70s, but at other times it wasn't as successful. So. And because Yugoslavia was one of the major founders of the non-aligned movement, that played a significant role in that regard. No other European countries didn't join it, except Cyprus, I guess, did, and I think Malta, but no other. Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, and so forth did not join. Please, while you and then we'll have to end.
Okay. So, fascinating talk. Nadia, you mentioned the people's democracy. I think at the time in the late 40s and early 50s, Stalin defined Yugoslavia and also China as people's democracy because they're not good enough to be proletariat dictatorship, because it's working class led revolution, and Yugoslavia, China, no, Europe has just so I think Tito was angry about that, and China brought back their tongue. The group decided, okay, we're people's democracy, and Stalin told China, you're not ready for socialism, gradualism, but after Stalin died, China changed both. Gradually, they started saying, we're the proletariat dictatorship. And also, they just started Stalinist economic system quickly, 53. They just started collectivization, industrialization. So my question for you is, has Yugoslavia ever changed to define themselves? Did they continue to say, we're people's democracy? Or did they really have this kind of drive to have a collectivization or industrialization like Stalin had? I'm very ignorant about that. So Do you have any answers to that?
Whether Yugoslavia during the Cold War, how it defined itself, I mean, I think it defined itself mostly as a socialist country.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, socialist.
Yeah.
It was called the League of Yugoslav Communists, so it alternated between those two self-descriptors, but I think, given that socialist was in the name of the country.
Yes, Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, yes.
Yes,
Before
it was federal.
really use the label People's Democracy
Yes.
after Stalin's
So
death.
that's how it defined,
Yes,
it defined itself. So usually Yugoslavia was called, I mean, we use the term Yugoslavia just for convenience. But we know very well that when the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was created in 1943, it was called Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia,
yes.
just like
yes,
it right.
Yes,
And then it changed its name to Socialist
Federal
Federal
Republic.
Republic of Yugoslavia later on. So that initial period, immediately during the Second World War and immediately after the Second World War until 60s, it was Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. So the name of the country speaks of how itself.
And the people's name remained in the name of the army.
Yeah, Yugoslav people, Yugoslavska, Yugoslav speak, the army of Yugoslavia.
Or Yugoslav National Army,
People's
People's Army, yeah.
People's Army. Yeah.
China too.
Mhm.
Also, I just want,
Continues to, yeah.
yeah, continues to. And
People's
China
Liberation.
actually also was part of this non-aligned movement. They
Yes,
was part of it.
yes,
And even today, China evokes this 5 principles,
Yes.
especially the one non-interference with
Yes.
others' business.
yes.
You know, don't touch our business, don't say our political events.
Yeah,
things like.
that's tradition of China's culture and India's culture and civilizations. That's something that's strange to the West.
But those principles though were primarily the product of Indonesia and India, much more so
Yes.
than China.
Hmm.
So, okay, let me draw this to a close and thank everyone for coming, and above all to thank both Milos and Nadia for their contributions. Thank you.